Book of Heaven, Volume 4, Part 5. November 20th, 1900. Since Luisa must live from the heart of Jesus, he gives her rules in order to undertake a more perfect way of living. While I am outside of myself, my adorable Jesus continues to show me my heart inside of his, but so transformed that I can no longer recognize which one is mine and which one is Jesus's. He has conformed it perfectly to his own. He has impressed on it all the insignia of the Passion, making me understand that, from the moment of his conception, his heart was conceived with these insignia of the Passion, so much so that what he suffered at the end of his life was an overflow of that which his heart had suffered continuously. I seem to see one just like the other. I seem to see my beloved Jesus occupied with preparing the place in which he was to put the heart, perfuming it and bejeweling it with many different flowers. And while he was doing this, he told me, "My beloved, since you must live from my heart, it is appropriate for you to undertake a more perfect way of living. Therefore, from you I want, number 1, perfect conformity to my will, because you will only be able to love me perfectly if you love me with my own will. Even more, I tell you that by loving me with my own will, you will arrive at loving me and your neighbor with my same way of loving. Number 2, profound humility, placing yourself in front of me and of creatures as the last among all. Number 3, purity in everything, because any slightest fault against purity, both in loving and in operating, is all reflected in the heart, and it remains stained. Therefore I want purity to be like dew upon the flowers at the rising of the sun, which, its rays reflecting upon them, transmutes those little drops into as many precious pearls, such as to enchant the people. In the same way, if all your works, thoughts and words, heartbeats and affections, desires and inclinations, are adorned with the celestial dew of purity, you will weave a sweet enchantment, not only for the human eye, but for the whole empyrean. Number 4, obedience, which must be connected with my will, because if this virtue regards the superiors I have given you on earth, my will is obedience which regards me directly, so much so that it can be said that both one and the other are virtues of obedience, with this difference alone: one regards God, and the other regards men. However, both of them have the same value, and one cannot be without the other. Therefore you must love both one and the other in the same way." Then he added, "Know that from now on you will live with my heart, and you must see things the way my heart does, that I may find my satisfactions in you. Therefore be careful, for this is no longer your heart, but mine." November 22nd, 1900. Jesus puts himself in the place of the heart and tells her what food he wants from her. My adorable Jesus continues to make himself seen. This morning, having received communion, I saw him in my interior, as well as our two hearts so identified with each other as to appear as one. My most sweet Jesus told me, "Today I have decided to give you back, not your heart, but myself in its place." At that moment I saw Jesus placing himself in that point where the heart is, and from within Jesus I received the respiration, and I felt the beating of his heart. How happy I felt living in this position! After this he added, "Since I myself have taken the place of the heart, it is appropriate for you to have food, always ready to nourish me. This food will be my will, and everything through which you will mortify yourself, and of which you will deprive yourself for love of me." But who can say all that passed between me and Jesus in my interior? I believe it is better to keep silent, otherwise I feel as if I would ruin it, since my tongue is not well refined to be able to speak of graces so great which the Lord has given to my soul. There is nothing left for me but to thank the Lord, who has looked upon a soul so miserable and sinful. November 23rd, 1900. How all souls are in Jesus. As I was in my usual state, my loving Jesus transported me outside of myself, and coming out from within my interior, he showed himself so big as to absorb the entire earth within himself, and he spread his magnitude so far that my soul could not find the end of it. I felt dispersed in God, and not only myself, but all creatures were dispersed in him. Oh, how unseemly it appeared! What an affront is given to our Lord, when we tiny little worms, while living in him, dare to offend him. Oh, if all could see the way we are in God, oh, how careful they would be not to cause him even a shadow of displeasure. Then he became so tall as to absorb the whole of heaven into himself. So in God himself I could see everyone, angels, saints. I could hear their singing. I could understand many things about eternal happiness. After this I saw many rivulets of milk flowing from Jesus, and I drank at those rivulets. But since I was very limited, and Jesus was so big and tall as to have no end, either in magnitude or in height, I could not manage to absorb them all into myself. Many of them would flow outside, though remaining in God himself. I felt a disappointment because of this, and I would have wanted everyone to run and drink at these rivulets. But so very scarce was the number of the pilgrim souls who would drink. Our Lord, too, was disappointed because of this, and he said to me, "What you see is the constrained mercy, and this irritates justice more. How can I not make justice when they themselves constrain my mercy inside of me?" And I, taking his hands, clasped them together, saying, "No, Lord, you cannot make justice. I do not want it, and since I do not want it, neither do you want it, because my will is no longer mine, but yours. And since it is yours, whatever I do not want, you do not want either. Have you yourself not told me that I must live of your will, entirely and completely?" My sweet Jesus was disarmed by my words. He made himself small again, and enclosed himself in my interior, and I found myself inside myself. November 25th, 1900. The nature of true love is to transmute pains into joys, bitternesses into sweetnesses. Since my most sweet Jesus delayed in coming, I was almost afraid he would not come. But then, to my surprise, all of a sudden he came and told me, "My beloved, do you want to know when it is that a work is done for one's beloved? When, encountering sacrifices, bitternesses, and pains, it has the virtue of changing them into sweetnesses and delights. In fact, this is the nature of true love, to transmute pains into joys, bitternesses into sweetnesses. If one experiences the opposite, it is a sign that it is not true love that is acting. Oh, in how many works they say, "I do this for God," but then in the encounters they draw back. With this they show that it was not for God, but for their own interest and for the pleasure they felt. Then he added, "Generally it is said that one's own will ruins everything and infects the holiest works. Yet, if this one's own will is connected with the will of God, there is no other virtue that can surpass it, because where there is a will, there is life in operating good. But where there is no will, there is death in operating, or one operates with difficulty, as though agonizing." December 3rd, 1900. The nature of the Most Holy Trinity is formed of most pure, most simple, communicative love. This morning, as I was outside of myself, I found myself with baby Jesus in my arms. And while I delighted in looking at him, I don't know how, from the same baby, a second came out. And after a few instants, a third baby, both of them similar to the first, though distinct among themselves. Stupefied in looking at this, I said, "Oh, how one can touch with hand the sacrosanct mystery of the Most Holy Trinity, that while you are one, you are also three." It seems to me that all three of them spoke to me, but as the word came out, it formed one single voice. Our nature is formed of most pure, most simple communicative love, and the nature of true love has this of its own. It produces from itself images fully similar to itself in power, in goodness, in beauty, and in everything it contains. And only to give more sublime prominence to our omnipotence, it places the mark of distinction, in such a way that melting in love, this nature of ours, which is simple, with no matter at all which might prevent the union, forms three persons, and returning to melt, it forms one. It is so true that the nature of true love has this prerogative of producing images fully similar to itself, or of assuming the image of the beloved, that the second person, in redeeming mankind, assumed the nature and the image of man, and communicated the divinity to man. While they were saying this, I could distinguish my beloved Jesus very well, recognizing in him the image of the human nature. And only because of him I had the confidence to remain in their presence. Otherwise, who would have dared? Ah, yes, it seemed to me that the humanity assumed by Jesus had opened commerce for the creature, in order to let her ascend up to the throne of the divinity, to be admitted to converse with them, and to obtain deeds of graces. Oh, what happy moments I enjoyed! How many things I comprehended! But in order to write something, I would need to describe it when my soul is with my dear Jesus, as it seems to be set free from the body. But as I find myself imprisoned again, the darkness of the imprisonment, the distance of my mystical son, the pain of not seeing him, render me incapable of describing it, and make me live dying. Yet I am forced to live, fastened, imprisoned in this miserable body. O Lord, have compassion for a miserable sinner who lives infirm and imprisoned. Break soon the wall of this prison, that I may fly to you, never to come back. December 23rd, 1900. Before the sanctity of the divine will, passions do not dare to come forward, and they lose life by themselves. After having gone through long days of silence between me and blessed Jesus, I felt a void in my interior. This morning on coming, he told me, "My beloved, what do you want to tell me that you so much yearn to speak with me?" And I, feeling all ashamed, said, "My sweet Jesus, I want to tell you that I ardently yearn for you and for your holy volition. And if you concede this to me, you will make me fully content and happy." And he added, "In one word, you have grasped everything by asking me for what is greatest in heaven and on earth. And I, in this holy volition, yearn and want to conform you more to it. And so that my volition may be more sweet and enjoyable for you, place yourself in the circle of my will and admire its different qualities by pausing now in the sanctity of my volition, now in the goodness, now in the humility, now in the beauty, and now in the peaceful dwelling that my volition produces. And in these pausings you will make, you will acquire ever more new and unheard of news about my holy volition, and you will become so bound to and enamored of it that you will never go out of it again. And this will bring you a highest advantage, because being in my will, you will have no need to fight against your passions and to be always at arms with them, for while they seem to be dying, they are born again more strong and alive. But rather, without fighting, without clamor, smoothly they die, because before the sanctity of my will, passions do not dare to come forward, and they lose life by themselves. And if the soul feels the movement of her passions, it is a sign that she does not make a continuous dwelling within the bounds of my volition. She makes some exits, some little escapes into her own volition, and is forced to smell the stench of a corrupted nature. On the other hand, if you remain fixed in my will, you will be completely free of trouble, and your only occupation will be loving me and being loved by me in return. After this, as I looked at blessed Jesus, I saw he had the crown of thorns. I removed it very gently, and I placed it upon my head. He drove it onto me and disappeared, and I found myself inside myself with an ardent desire to remain in his most holy will. At this point, I'm going to read the annotation at the bottom of the page, which explains the understanding of divine will and the phrase divine volition. The word will translates from the Italian volontà. We know from the writings of Luisa that the will of God is the boundless container, which contains all the acts of God, and that the will of God and the acts of God possess the same qualities as the nature of God. They are infinite, omnipotent, eternal, as God is. The word volition translates from the Italian volere. This word indicates the will in act. This distinction could be relevant in the case of a human will and of human acts, which are finite and limited, as they possess the same qualities as the human nature. Therefore they have a beginning and an end. So we could distinguish between whether they are in act or not. But when we speak about will of God and volition of God, the distinction does not exist. In fact, the will of God is, yes, the boundless container of all the acts of God, but we know that the acts of God are always in act, always present, and therefore there is no distinction between whether these acts are in act or not. The acts of God are simply always and eternally in act. Therefore, though there may be a semantic difference between the words will and volition, when referring to God, any actual distinction disappears, because in God, will and will in act are exactly the same. So when we find the two words in the writings of Luisa, we can interpret them in the same way. Just as in Italian, divina volontà and divino volere are used interchangeably and mean exactly the same, so do divine will and divine volition. December 25th, 1900. The birth of Jesus. As I was in my usual state, I felt I was outside of myself, and after wandering around, I found myself inside a cave, and I saw the Queen Mamma in the act of giving birth to little baby Jesus. What a stupendous prodigy! It seemed to me that both mother and son were transmuted into most pure light. But in that light, one could see very well the human nature of Jesus, containing the divinity within itself, and serving as a veil to cover the divinity, in such a way that, tearing the veil of the human nature, he was God. While covered with that veil, he was man. Here is the prodigy of prodigies, God and man and God, without leaving the Father and the Holy Spirit, because true love never separates. He comes to dwell in our midst, taking on human flesh. Now it seemed to me that mother and son, in that most happy instant, remained as though spiritualized, and without the slightest difficulty, Jesus came out of the maternal womb, while both of them overflowed with excess of love. In other words, those most pure bodies were transformed into light, and without the slightest impediment, light, Jesus, came out of the light of the mother, while both one and the other remained whole and intact, returning then to their natural state. But who can tell the beauty of the little baby who at the moment of his birth transfused also externally the rays of the divinity? Who can tell the beauty of the mother who remained all absorbed in those divine rays? And Saint Joseph? It seemed to me that he was not present at the act of the birth, but remained in another corner of the cave, all engrossed in that profound mystery. And if he did not see with the eyes of the body, he saw very well with the eyes of the soul, because he remained enraptured in sublime ecstasy. Now, in the act in which the little baby came out to the light, I would have wanted to fly and take him in my arms, but the angels prevented me, telling me that the honor of holding him first belonged to the mother. Then the Most Holy Virgin, as though stirred, returned into herself, and from the hands of an angel received her son into her arms. In her ardor of love, she squeezed him so tightly that it seemed that she wanted to enclose him into her womb again. Then, wanting to give vent to her ardent love, she placed him at her breast to suckle. In the meantime, I was there completely annihilated, waiting to be called so as not to be scolded again by the angels. Then the queen said to me, "Come, come and take your beloved, and you too enjoy him. Pour out your love with him." As she was saying this, I drew near Mamma, and she gave him to me, into my arms. Who can say my contentment? The kisses, the squeezes, the tendernesses. After I poured myself out a little, I said to him, "My beloved, you have suckled the milk of our Mamma. Share it with me." And he, all condescending, poured part of that milk from his mouth into mine, and then he told me, "My beloved, I was conceived united to suffering. I was born to suffering, and I died in suffering. And with the 3 nails with which they crucified me, I nailed the 3 powers, intellect, memory, and will, of those souls who yearn to love me, keeping them all drawn to myself, because sin had rendered them infirm and dispersed them from their Creator without any restraint." As he was saying this, he gazed at the world and began to cry over its miseries. On seeing him cry, I said, "Lovable baby, do not sadden with your tears a night so happy for one who loves you. Instead of pouring ourselves out in crying, let us pour ourselves out in singing." And as I said this, I began to sing. Jesus was amused at hearing me sing, and he stopped crying. And completing my verse, he sang his own, with a voice so powerful and harmonious that all other voices disappeared at the sound of his most sweet voice. After this, I prayed to baby Jesus for my confessor, for those who belonged to me, and lastly, for everyone. And he seemed all condescending. At that moment, he disappeared from me, and I returned into myself. December 26, 1900. She is still in the grotto. As I continued to see the Holy Baby, I saw the Queen Mother on one side and Saint Joseph on the other, adoring the divine infant profoundly. Being all intent on him, it seemed to me that the continuous presence of the little baby kept them engrossed in continuous ecstasy. And if they could work, it was a prodigy that the Lord operated in them. Otherwise they would have remained motionless, unable to attend their external duties. I too did my adoration, and then I found myself inside myself. December 27th, 1900. God is not subject to changing, while the devil and the human nature change very often. This morning, I was with a fear about my state that it was not the Lord who operated in me, with the addition that he was not deigning to come. Then, after much waiting, I saw him for just a little. I expressed my fear to him, and he said to me, "My daughter, first of all, in order to put you in this state, there is a concourse of my power. And besides, who would have given you the strength and the patience to remain in this state, in a bed, for such a long time? Perseverance alone is a sure sign that the work is mine, because God alone is not subject to changing, while the devil and the human nature change so very often. What they love today, they abhor tomorrow, and what they abhor today, they love tomorrow, and find in it their satisfaction. You have reached the end of the Book of Heaven, Volume 4, Part 5. Fiat.